Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're joined by Dr. Luke Barnes to talk about fine-tuning arguments. This is part of our series on natural theology and arguments for the existence of God. This is an introductory series, so if you're interested in kind of understanding more about these topics at the end of this video, like all of these series, we'll be introducing you more books so you can delve deeper into these works. So without further ado, Dr. Luke Barnes, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Is there any thing that you would like to introduce about yourself, kind of what you work on or kind of where you are at right now?
Sure. I'm a lecturer in physics at Western Sydney University. I'm an astrophysicist and sort of cosmologist. So my recent research papers have been things about how galaxies form and radio observations of galaxies and very much an interest and an active research interest in this question of the fine-tuning of the universe for life.
That sounds great. So first of all, let's get started with the most simple and broadest question. What are fine-tuning arguments?
So fine-tuning arguments are ones that sort of crept up on natural theology, as it were. So there's all these sort of arguments for the existence of God that have been debated for thousands of years. About 50 years ago, a new one popped up, which came out of not from theologians or even philosophers, but from physicists. So what happened was, as physicists looked at the sort of best laws of nature that we had at the time, the deepest laws that described sort of the most stuff, we noticed that in those laws that there are fundamental constants, there are numbers that describe the various properties of the universe. So, for example, we think that if you break matter down to its smallest pieces, one of those pieces is going to be something called the electron, which you might remember goes around the atom. And to describe the way our world works, we need to know the mass, that how heavy is a single electron. And it's obviously a very small number. It's a number we can measure, but it's not a number we predict. It's something we put into our equations rather than a prediction we get out of our equations. What was noticed was that with a lot of these numbers, if you ask the question, why are they what they are? Why does it have that value rather than another one? You don't get an answer from physics because they're fundamental parameters, at the moment at least. But if you ask what if they'd been different, it was noticed that there were some very weird things started to happen to the universe if these numbers had been different. For some of them, there would be some rather radical changes to the way the universe works. So, for example, the bonding of atoms together into chemistry and all the stuff the universe is made out of, it was quite easy to change the parameters a little bit and have that process simply fail to happen at all, or have a universe that expands too fast. And so, actually, in response to this, fine-tuning arguments came around. So, obviously, this sort of fact, if you are the sort of person who sees design or purpose, intentionality, intelligence in nature, sort of behind nature, as it were, the fact that just any old universe won't make life is something that sits quite neatly with your worldview. And so, as physicists noticed fine-tuning, then philosophers started to debate about it, and philosophers of religion especially said, look, this is very consistent with the idea that there's a good creator of the universe, and not the sort of thing you'd expect if the universe were just kind of a brute fact, or just there, or nothing particularly special or remarkable about it. So those are the attempt to turn this fact from physics of fine-tuning into an argument for the existence of God. That's the sort of family of fine-tuning arguments.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps developing on that, a lot of times when people are introduced to these arguments for the existence of God, they see that a lot of these broader kind of topics have individual formulations. For example, they're looking at the cosmological arguments, say maybe the contingency arguments, and then the Kalam argument that William Lane Craig likes to propose. And then maybe with ontological arguments, they have like an Anselmian ontological argument, and there's a Plantinga's modal ontological argument. Would you say that there's kind of a similar kind of variation of different varieties that an apologist or a theist may be using when they come to, or they are approaching fine-tuning arguments?
Yeah, not quite as wide a variety as, say, like the cosmological argument is actually a very wide and broad family of arguments. The fine-tuning arguments, I guess design arguments, teleological arguments are quite a big sort of the equivalent there of a large family of different approaches. For fine-tuning arguments, there's a couple of different approaches, and a lot of it comes down to the approach that you take to probabilities. So perhaps the most famous is due to William Lane Craig. So he is in it's sort of designed to be presentable very quickly in a debate. So it's, the fine tuning of the universe is best explained either by necessity, so it had to be this way, by chance, it just happened to be this way, or by design, a designer wanted it to be this way. The fine tuning is not due to necessity or chance, and there's separate arguments for that. Therefore, the explanation of fine tuning is due to design. So that presents it in a very compact way. Your job then is to defend the premises. The other approach, which is the one that I guess Richard Swinburne and Robin Collins and myself and a few other people would take more of a sort of a probabilistic approach. There's an approach to probabilities known as Bayesian probabilities, but we don't have to go into too many of those details. But that comes as kind of a not an argument necessarily that therefore God exists, but that therefore the probability that God exists gets a massive bump up once you understand the fine-tuning of the universe. So the argument would be something like, if there's something that we know to be true, and it's much more likely on hypothesis A than hypothesis B, then the hypothesis that makes it much more likely gets a boost from the fact that we know A. The fact that we know this, whatever that fact was, and the fact that then is crucial is that this universe is life permitting, and what we discovered was we obviously didn't discover that fact. What we discovered was that actually that fact seems very unlikely given, say, naturalism, if you just think that the universe is all there is. So the argument would go, where you have that imbalance of probabilities, the one that gives the much higher probability is strongly favored. This is the scenario. So a life-permitting universe is much more likely on theism than on naturalism, and the argument for that is just because it's so ridiculously low on naturalism. Therefore, fine-tuning is evidence, and quite strong and very good evidence for theism over naturalism in a straight sort of shootout between those two. So those are the two main formulations.
So when someone perhaps is using these two formulations, would you think that kind of the objections to these formulations are kind of similar to both of the arguments, or would people normally be expecting kind of a different approach when they're preparing to use two formulations?
So I think there's definitely a core set of objections that would be aimed at both of them. If you're trying to do things with probabilities, I think there's a separate set that. So I mean the question, where are these probabilities coming from? What do they mean? Is something that would most strongly apply to the second set, obviously. But there's a long and interesting list of responses that people give to fine-tuning in general, and then on top of that to fine-tuning arguments. So actually, I'll quickly mention the book A Fortunate Universe, just there behind me, which I wrote with my colleague Geraint Lewis, who's actually an atheist. But we wrote the first 7 chapters together, and chapter 7 was just a collection of ways that people respond to the argument, which we don't actually think are good. So we sort of respond back to all of those before, in the last chapter, then having a discussion about what we think it really means. But there's a whole, I think we get up to, A, B, C, D, all the way up to O by the end of the chapter.
Yes. Are there perhaps any one of them which kind of like stands out, or perhaps are more commonly used, or are they kind of all equally as popular?
No, well, the funny thing is, so the way we wrote the book, this is relevant, stay on board, was I gave a talk about all this fine-tuning stuff because I'd done some research on it to the group of astronomers that Sydney Institute for Astronomy at Sydney University. Just because they were kind of interested. I'd done a talk elsewhere. Anyway, Geraint was in the audience and he heard that, and then, this is great, we should write a book about this, because he was my colleague at the time. The fascinating thing was, and I've never seen this before or since, I did the usual astronomy seminar, 45 minutes, and then everyone sat around in the room for like an hour and a half debating what this means and what we do with it and what the hell is going on. And it wasn't that people were interrogating me so as much as there was an awful lot, and I've never seen it before, in the crowd amongst each other. People say, it obviously means this, or it obviously means that, or obviously this is the right response, or that is the right response. So there isn't really one response. We just get all sorts of things. So I did a talk, it was a while ago now, actually. It was in New Zealand at a skeptics in the pub meeting. Good bunch of people just on I think it was a Tuesday night or something. It was quite nice. I gave my talk, and then not only were they questioning me, but they started sort of debating amongst themselves. And it's great because that means that they're sort of into it. So I don't think there's any particularly central one. One of the things I do like to do with them, I think this is the closest you get to a general strategy, is I like something that I've called, it's not original to me, I just made this name up because I like it. I call it the awesome theological argument. And it's basically, what if you went out one night and everyone all over the world looked up into the night sky and the stars had arranged themselves to spell out in the language of each local area the first 14 verses of John, for example. That, I think, would be a very good argument for something. There would be something to conclude from that in terms of design. And so what you can do is to say, okay, your response that you've got to fine-tuning, take that same sort of response and apply it to the awesome theological argument. Hey, look, the stars just spelled out the first 14 chapters of the book of John, and just test it out and see if it works, because the awesome theological argument should be successful if that ever happened. And so your objection had better not be successful against that argument in principle, otherwise it's doing way too much. And so an objection like, for example, we don't know how probable, we don't really know. Let me give you an example. So something like, we're not really sure what God would want to do or not want to do. We're not really sure whether God would want to make life, or whether he would like to make black holes, or whether he just likes empty space. And okay, there's an objection to fine-tuning. Let's take that sort of objection and apply it to the John in the night sky. And you'd have to say something like, we're not sure whether God would want to write out the first 14 verses of John, or a bit of Matthew, or maybe some Psalms, or something else. Or and yes, that's in a sense true, but it shouldn't overturn the argument. Whatever improbability there is of not exactly knowing what God might or might not do, you'd better not conclude for that. Therefore, this message in the stars doesn't mean anything. And it's a similar sort of thing. If the probabilities sort of weigh out, overwhelm one another that convincingly, it better not be the case that not being entirely sure what God might or might not do overwhelms the argument. So I think that's the closest I can get to a general principle.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps developing on that, of course, you raised the idea that where do these probability come from? If someone was perhaps just entering into philosophy or entering into fine-tuning arguments and they hear such a response, what are certain things that they can say perhaps in response to that?
Well, this is where you're starting to get a bit technical and a bit into the weeds. So what the hard bit is actually the type of probability we're all taught in, say, high school, is a very small subset of what you do in probability as what I do in probability as a scientist, for example. The toolkit is so much bigger than what they gave you in high school. But if you try to use the high school toolkit, it won't work. So you have people making objections saying things like, you only know probabilities if you've watched a whole bunch of trials and then you can count this one versus that one. So you only know that the probability of heads is a half if you've watched a whole bunch of coin flips and counted how many heads there've been out of the total. And yes, that's a type of probability, but it's widely recognized amongst science that won't do. That's not enough. We need more than that if we're going to do things like have theories like quantum mechanics, which can make probabilistic predictions, if we can use probability as a tool for testing theories. So the buzzword here, the important word is Bayesian. So there was a mathematician, Thomas Bayes, end of the 19th century, I think. He was actually a Presbyterian minister, who is the name attached to an approach to probability theory, which sort of goes out of fashion and comes roaring back through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and especially now later on, especially as computers have let us do some more powerful things. And the claim is made, for example, there's a very influential book by Edwin Jaynes, Jaynes, called just, I think, Probability, the Science of Logic. Sorry, the Logic of Science, sorry. The claim is that I can put the mathematical apparatus, if you like, of probabilities, and I can use that to model degrees of support. I would use that terminology. How plausible one idea is in the light of another one. So it's really, and Jaynes does this, if you think about a logical connection that, this is a logical proof of that, say, well, if you weaken that off a bit, you could say this is not, it doesn't prove that, but it supports it. In the same way that, if I see that the grass outside is wet, I can say that supports, it doesn't prove, but it supports the idea that it rained here within the last hour, say. Mm-hmm. And that's, as a scientist, you're always dealing with incomplete information and clues, and you just don't get that sort of logical certainty that you get from, proper airtight, watertight logic. But what we can do is model the way in which one idea supports another idea in logical and this plausibility connections. So that's the kind of probability. It's widely used in science, and that's the sort of thing that underlies I mentioned two approaches to fine-tuning, the sort of second approach.
What would you say are the differences between fine-tuning and design arguments? Because I suppose when people are taught when I remember when I was back in Sunday school, they used to say, well, look at the trees and look at the beauty of the world, and how could there not be a God? And in some sense, it seems, as you said previously, that they're kind of in the same category of these fine-tuning arguments, not exactly the same kind of argument, and they don't really have the same structure. How would you kind of describe or kind of compare the two together?
I've changed my thinking on this recently. I used to think that there was a variety of design arguments, and then the fine-tuning was just sort of one of them. So, it's trying to say there's something well put together about some feature of our universe. The way I've been thinking about it recently is actually that the fine-tuning argument is almost, it's a rematch from the design argument in the following sense. It's actually behind me, Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. He says, I think it's something along the lines of biology is the study of things that look designed. And so that's why it works at a Sunday school level. You just say, is there a God? Well, look how well put together this place is. Go and look at, I'm reading a book at the moment called The Mind of a Bee. It's because someone recommended it to me. Just about the complexity of bees. It's remarkable that this universe, and, I often like to, when I'm doing a talk, just to show a picture of a hummingbird just slowly flapping its wings. And, if you built that, you'd be a genius, right? No one's ever built anything remotely that complicated. And so, actually, here's how I think the sort of the dialectic, the back and forth works. That humans, basically everywhere, basically for the whole of history, have thought: is there a mind behind the universe? Yes, because this place looks well put together. And then you get the kind of response from, I guess maybe David Hume is where it started, but the sort of thing that Dawkins is exemplifying there of, if we can reduce it down to physics, then we won't be tempted to invoke design. I think he almost explicitly says that in the book. Biology is the study of things that tempt us to invoke design, and physics is the study of things that don't tempt us to invoke design. That's not quite what he said. He always says things better than you can paraphrase them, because he's a great writer. Okay, So looks designed, oh, but it's based on physics. And now the question is, does any old physics work to underlie bumblebees and trees and hummingbirds and all of this? The claim is supposed to be, okay, this universe looks amazing and well put designed together, but at bottom it's just typical, and atoms, and they'll just do their own thing. It's all mechanical and there's nothing special going on down there. And what fine tuning says is, okay, let's try and be a bit systematic about this. Is this really just a typical collection of atoms? And a way we could think about that is, what other ways could atoms have been? So one of the things that Dawkins relies on as a way of saying, here's why you think a bird is designed, is because if you just threw its cells together, you wouldn't get something that flies. Okay, throw a universe together. This is what fine-tuning lets us do. Imagine you just thrown any old set of electrons in with any old electron mass and all the other stuff. Will it fly? Will it do anything interesting? And the answer from fine-tuning seems to be no. So thought about that way, I think it's reinforcing actually what I'd call the design intuition. If you look around at the universe and think, oh, well, this place is incredible. Of course, there's someone's thought this through on some level. There's a whole bunch of stuff I don't understand, but clearly a mind behind it is a better explanation than just a chance or randomness or just pure mechanism or nothing whatsoever. And if the challenge is made, oh, that's because we've lost that battle for design. Let's go a level deeper down into physics. Well, fine-tuning says, oh, it looks pretty well put together down here as well.
So perhaps developing on this idea, how does one get from fine-tuning to God? Of course, in cosmological arguments, there seems to be like two stages. First, to demonstrate a necessary cause, and then they then talk about kind of what that necessary cause is. In fine-tuning arguments, is it perhaps a bit more intuitive and easier to kind of make that jump from kind of, okay, there's the universe is finely tuned to the existence of God? Would you say that kind of process is a bit easier when it comes to fine-tuning?
I think it's a little bit more obvious, but it's not as, it doesn't quite get you to a necessary being or necessary existence, or when you think of cosmological arguments, especially something like Leibniz, contingency argument. The whole point is you get to a whole bunch of contingent stuff won't explain itself. We need a different kind of thing that's not just another contingent something or other, that a bit more of furniture of existence. I think for the design argument, for the fine-tuning argument, the way that you get to God in the first way I explained was sort of by elimination. Not a complete elimination, but the best explanation is not chance or necessity, therefore it's design. But that doesn't get you particularly far. It won't distinguish between, say, a designer who's just a computer engineer in the next universe up, or Hume famously said about the design argument, well, it might be some bumbling designer who's had loads of goes at making a universe and messed up a million before he finally hit upon this one, which actually works. And yeah, I mean, actually, I think the thing to say to Hume is, yeah, sure, maybe. If we've moved on from just thinking that this universe is it, but it doesn't quite tell us where to go next. For the Bayesian formulation, if you're thinking about what would we expect to observe if this was true or if that was true, the way God gets introduced is just by being one of the live hypotheses, one of the live possible explanations. And if it seems obvious, or if you can provide a good argument for the fact that a life-permitting universe doesn't seem ridiculously unlikely given God's existence, then that wins over the naturalism hypothesis, and that's how you do it. You don't have to make any sort of special assumption. There's just a live range of options, and your job is simply to show this one gets a higher probability than that one.
So perhaps developing on to this case, how would you say the fine-tuning argument kind of fits alongside other arguments would you recommend if someone were perhaps to use fine-tuning arguments, also study a few other arguments to kind of demonstrate that not only is there a necessary cause, there's also kind of like maybe a designer, and put all those together in some sense, then you kind of have God, kind of how William Lane Craig normally does in a debate, perhaps.
So, I mean, this is sort of a question of strategy, and that depends on who you're talking to. There's a very logical way where you would start off with almost, I would think actually the Leibnizian argument's a good starting point, because it gets you to at least a sort of, something exists necessarily, God fits the bill, and then you're worried, are we sure that this is a mind? And then, oh, look, if we assume it is something with intelligence, and a very basic picture of intelligence of, I can intend a certain outcome. I can make a decision now based on something that will happen or hasn't happened yet, or I can have an idea and then bring it into reality. That's all you need. That coming next sort of fits in nicely. Who is this? What is this necessary thing that explains existence? Well, if it was also the thing that explained why our universe is well put together, then we're on our way at least to the idea of God. However, I think one of the great advantages, one of the features of the fine-tuning argument, is how little you have to buy metaphysically before you can see that it's a good argument. I think it's, I often worry about presentations of arguments for the existence of God, that there's a lot of metaphysical baggage you've got to buy beforehand. So I've read, and I'm quite fond of and a fan of the work of Ed Feser, who's a philosopher, published stuff on arguments for the existence of God, especially sort of classical, Aquinas style arguments for the existence of God. But his strategy is to sort of, you've got to buy the whole of neo-Aristotelian metaphysics, and then if you buy that, God is sort of waiting there for you. But you've almost got to buy the whole metaphysical system to realize that the system needs God at the top or the bottom, or however you want to think about that. So I've heard him give a talk on saying, that his arguments are better because they don't depend on the shifting sands of where science is right now. And there's some truth to that, but there's also quite a high buy-in. Even something like, say, the Leibnizian argument, where you want to argue to a metaphysically necessary being. Well, metaphysically necessary is actually quite a difficult concept for some people. It was a fairly difficult concept for me for quite a while. I mean, and so I think it's quite remarkable, the fine-tuning argument, of how much of the argument you get from science, from just what we're doing in physics. All you need other than that is almost the most broad, fairly vague, intuitive sense of what the idea of God is sort of supposed to be, and that'll actually be enough. That'll get you any sort of idea about what God might be, because naturalism does so badly that even that idea will end up doing better.
Definitely. Perhaps I'm developing this further. Sometimes when people, like, for example, in the philosophy of religion, they talk about the problem of evil. And sometimes when they talk about, well, what do you do with a world where there's like a random rock and then it crushes someone or something like that, and explain natural evil? And I will sometimes respond to that by saying, well, okay, well, imagine a world in which the rock does not fall down a hill and instead floats into the sky and there's no gravity. Well, would we exist? Perhaps I suppose it is somewhat connected to fine-tuning. Well, how would the world be, perhaps, if certain of these constants, like gravity, or perhaps some kind of the causation of fire, or I'm no scientist myself, I know nothing about what I'm talking really, but it seems intuitive to me that the world would be significantly different and life would be significantly different if these things changed in the slightest kind of fashion.
Well, some of this wasn't really predicted by anyone. It might seem obvious now, but actually this was really a shock to scientists. And we're talking here the 1970s, Brandon Carter is one of the names to start with, as people started to look into this. Because there'd been so much of say Bertrand Russell saying things like we're just accidental collocations of atoms. The laws are just mechanical. There's nothing particularly special about the laws. Everything just runs itself. We're a typical planet around a typical star and a typical outskirts of a typical galaxy. All of this sort of rhetoric of where there's nothing special going on around here, and then to suddenly see that actually there's something remarkably rare about the abilities of our electrons that other universes with different fundamental constants wouldn't have, where things don't stick to each other, was actually quite the shock. It's not, it's not anything inevitable. It could have very easily turned out a priori before we actually did the calculations that actually, this is any old rock around any old star. These are any old electrons, any old forces, any old expansion of the universe, any old overall structure of stuff. And the laws, once they're there, will just sort all of this out. Don't worry about it. And that's not how things turned out. This is why it's such a surprising and arresting fact that, having been told that, this is just a typical universe, suddenly right at the bottom, right down at the lowest level physics has got to, we find our universe has a remarkably rare set of properties.
That sounds great. Perhaps before we end off this video, there's a few questions that have been sent in by some subscribers. Firstly, do electrons in love type scenarios significantly reduce the degree to which theism predicts fine-tuning?
So here's the idea. I think the idea is this, and I don't want to, I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting the paper, but there's a range of objections which roughly go under this heading, which basically say, look, we're talking about God fine-tuning a universe. This picture of there's the laws and then there's God with all the dials. He's just got to get everything just right, and then bam, off he goes and he makes a universe, and everything turns out okay. Well done, God. And God can do anything. God could make any old matter do whatever it likes. You could have, there are these mechanical laws, but he could have made a universe where just, electrons are in love with each other, and that's how things are explained. There's just so many possibilities of how God could make a life-permitting universe that, the idea that it predicts this kind of universe, where there are mechanical laws with, fine-tuned constants, that's not very likely. Because it comes from a range, here's all, you might think that God makes this universe is something that you might expect God to do, but here's all the things God could have done. So in that range, the way the universe turns out to be a very small and thus unlikely possibility. I think the response to that is, again, remember the awesome theological argument. You might think there's loads of stuff God could have done to prove his existence. Could have put a smiley face in the clouds. In the stars would be more impressive. Could have spelt out any number of messages of any length. Could have just written out the first 6 verses of John. Could have put in, his favorite psalm. Could have just done, a flying bird or something. It better not be the case that overturns the awesome theological argument, because you've got in this Bayesian framework, in the framework where you're weighing probabilities. Again, you are weighing probabilities. You're weighing these different ideas about how, explanations. And so the question is not whether, it's no claim of the fine-tuning argument that the way our world is very likely. That's no part of it. Or it doesn't have to be an absolute claim. It only has to be a relative claim. It just has to be more likely than the extremely unlikely probability that you got a perfectly life-permitting universe on naturalism. And so there's no reason to think that it affects it. Even if you thought, okay, I can think of, there's the fine-tuned mechanical laws scenario, there's electrons in love. Think of 10,000 other possibilities. And if we don't know which one of those God might choose, at most that affects our probabilities by, a factor of 1 in 10,000, maybe. Who cares? The sort of improbabilities we get from naturalism are, 1 part in 10 to the 100, 1 part in 10 to this, that, and the other. So, yeah, it just doesn't affect the argument just because naturalism is so bad at explaining a life-permitting universe.
That sounds great. Perhaps another question which is related to fine-tuning arguments as well. How permissive does someone's modal epistemology have to be for them to find fine-tuning arguments persuasive?
That's an interesting one. Okay, I'm not going to pretend to be a philosopher, and my grasp of modal logic and modal epistemology is pretty low. I think the advantage of a fine-tuning argument is that almost all the pieces come from just the way we do physics. Now, sometimes people don't understand the way we do physics, right? Which is why you get objections like, oh, you only get probabilities if you've seen, 1,000 flips of the coin, and that's the only way you get probabilities. And that's just not the way we do. I mean, probability is more than that, and science needs it to be more than that. I have in my toolkit more advanced versions of probability, which will do just fine. Other than that, again, just some vague idea of what God is supposed to be, and if God's a mind, the way minds work at their most basic is that I can imagine something of all the possibilities of what I might do next. I can imagine them and then choose them, and then have that one thing happen, so that something which might appear, unlikely if it were just chosen at random, can actually be likely given that a mind chose it. Or to put it another way, something that would be unlikely given just the state of things at a certain time becomes likely because a mind knows that that's going to be the outcome that does it. Like punching a code into a safe or something. All the codes, all the numbers might seem the same. There's a trillion possible combinations, except that if you've got a mind and you know the one that opens the safe, suddenly that one becomes much more likely. So I don't think you need to do things. You need too much metaphysical baggage for the fine-tuning argument. Certainly, that's my hope.
Definitely. And perhaps the final question would be, I think he was quite a fan of your discussion with Sean Carroll. He says, would you be willing to talk to Sean Carroll live again? I know you responded to a lot of his content since last time, but I enjoyed the last time so much.
Oh, good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Sean's great. I've had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of times and talking in a couple of different things. So actually, I'm going to be on someone else's YouTube channel in the next couple of days. There's another thing he's talking about fine-tuning, and I'll have a chat about that. Sean's very impressive in that he is a world-class cosmologist, of course, but he also knows the philosophy pretty well, well enough to respect it and have that sort of mind that can dig down into the philosophical issues and, get his head around them and raise objections that really properly get you thinking about the argument, as opposed to some other cosmologists at a popular level who perhaps took on a question like, why is there something rather than nothing, and wrote a book about it and didn't understand the question in the first place. There's, Sean's not that kind of, oh, we don't need any of this philosophy nonsense, and then you end up just doing philosophy badly. That's all that means. He actually has thought things through. So he's the sort of person you'd sort of, I think his book's right, must be right behind me. Which way do I need to go? That's probably it, like there. The big picture. Always worth engaging with.
Definitely. And perhaps you've touched on it a bit to end off this video. What would be some book recommendations for people if they're interested in kind of fine-tuning arguments and do they want to learn more about it? Where can they turn to?
If you want to see it in the overall picture of a complete argument for the existence of God, I think The Existence of God by Richard Swinburne is excellent. If you want to see it in the context of of physics and sort of how do you put physics and science and religion together, and I think it's there. Stephen Barr's Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. That's a good one as well. So Geraint Lewis and I, that's that book there, A Fortunate Universe. Just try to say, try to cover the whole thing at a popular level. The physics. So again, he was an atheist. He's an atheist. Wrote 7 chapters together and then spent the last chapter just discussing what we think all of it means. and various articles and talks by Robin Collins. Again, someone who knows the physics, knows the philosophy very well. He's quite good on all of those sorts of things. If you want to get it from just straight from a scientist, Paul Davis has a book called either called The Cosmic Jackpot or the Goldilocks Enigma. I think it's called The Goldilocks Enigma. Excellent. 2000, I want to say 10, that was released. And Martin Rees's book, REES, Just Six Numbers, is fantastic, a classic of the field.
Definitely. So make sure you go check those those books out. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to fine-tuning arguments. Of course, if you have any questions, then feel free to let us know in the comments below. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching, and God bless. I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.